Ave Maria.
A reading from the letter of St. Paul to the Hebrews. Brethren, call to mind the days gone by, in which, after you had been enlightened, you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by making common cause of those who fared thus. For you both have had compassion on those in prison, and have joyfully accepted the plundering of your own goods, knowing that you have a better possession and a lasting one. Do not therefore lose your confidence, which has a great reward, for you have need of patience that, doing the will of God, you may receive the promise. For yet a very little while, and he who is to come will come, and will not delay. Now my just one lives by faith. Today's feast is that of Saint Hippolytus and Cassian. They were saints of the 3rd century. And again, little is known of the details of their lives, because I suppose for many reasons, they were, in the eyes of the world, ordinary people. And in the church, there were so many people, so many Christians who were suffering, who were being martyred. And it's usually those who stand out as being exceptional that are remembered. In the case of St. Cassian, all we know about him is that he was a bishop. During the persecutions, he was expelled from his see, and he decided to go to Rome. And on the way, he stopped at the town of Imola, where they were in need of a priest. And so he set himself to teach the children, basically to earn his living, but he was teaching them not only the necessary subjects, but also Christianity. And it so happened that he was arrested. And his martyrdom was particularly cruel, because the authorities determined that he would be killed by his own students. And since these were little children, the stylus, the pen that they used, which was metal, because it was used to scrape the wax or the tablets of the time, the little metal points, these children literally stabbed him to death. So his death was prolonged, and he died in agony. For that reason, he's the patron saint of secretaries and writers. But Saint Hippolytus, however, we know a little more about. He's mentioned by Eusebius as well as by Saint Jerome in their histories. What we do know, he was born about the year 170, which is the beginning of the 3rd century. So that's the period in which he was active. Being born in 170, it meant that he knew some of the apostolic fathers. Certainly, he was known to Saint Irenaeus, and he knew Saint Irenaeus. Saint Irenaeus died about the year 202. This is an important connection, because Saint John the Evangelist was the teacher of Saint Polycarp of Smyrna. Saint Polycarp, in turn, was the teacher of Irenaeus, and Irenaeus now is the teacher of Saint Hippolytus. In that time, about the 200s, early part of the 200s, there were a lot of heresies floating around, because the church was preaching the gospel, but there were the philosophers and the theologians who were trying to make sense of the gospel, because our faith is one of faith and reason. Christianity is faith and reason. It's not blind faith. And certainly, the faith must not be the servant of reason, but on the contrary, we bring reason so as to interpret the faith correctly. And so, one of the great heresies or one of the controversies at the time, which led to many heresies, was that how do we explain the Trinity? And there were some who said that there's only one God, which is indeed true. But since we know from the scriptures there's a Father and the Son, how do we understand this? And they were saying, well, it's this one God, and he's just taken different aspects. So at one time he appears to the Father, and at the time he appears to the Son, which is heresy called modalism. And this was rejected, of course, by the church. Yet nonetheless, the exact formula, the formulation of the theology had not yet been done. And so Hippolytus, who was a teacher, he was a philosopher, was very concerned about these things. And he was convinced that the Pope was wrong, and the Pope Pontian, I believe, was not willing to pronounce on the issue because it had not yet been clarified. And so Hippolytus found himself in conflict with the Pope. It became even worse because the successor to Pontian, Callistus, was adopting a very soft approach towards people, repentant sinners. There were three great sins which the church held in abhorrence. One is idolatry, apostasy, and adultery. And the practice at the time, any Christian who committed these sins was permanently excommunicated. So in the case of idolatry, which would be that was clear enough, and of course this in the midst of persecution, it meant that Christians had a benchmark. They knew that if they offered the incense, they were committing idolatry, they'd be excluded from the church. In the case of apostasy, this was to desert the church, and that also was a sin that was not being forgiven, and adultery. So you can imagine what would happen today. Anyway, the Pope Callistus thought that this was too harsh, and so he was permitting these sinners to return, but he gave them a very heavy penance, usually 10 years of fasting or something. It was again to get the Christians to understand that these were serious sins and should not be taken lightly. And Hippolytus had a problem with that. He said, no, the church is softening up. So he was elected anti-pope. He said that he was the pope and not Callistus. And so he becomes the first anti-pope in the church. And so from this position, and he would remain as anti-pope for some 17 years, in this position he wrote a great deal. And he was sticking very firmly to the tradition of the church, that those teachings that the apostles themselves had handed down. And so this is one of the great strong points that he had in his writings, and he could do so because he was fourth generation. It was St. John, Polycarp, Irenaeus, and himself. So he was able to gather all of this together, and he wrote in Greek, because at the time the church's language was, for the most part, Greek. And because of this, in fact, his writings would not be as well known in the West as they are in the East. So the Eastern Church has a great veneration to him. Anyway, in his writings, he was one who wrote the canon of the Mass, as we have it. He itemized what it was that we prayed for. He also gives us the right for the ordination of bishops, and he talks about the Lord's Day rather than the Sabbath, and we're talking about the early 200s. So we can see that the church then and now we can see the similarity or the continuity between the two. As things turned out, he was arrested and sent to Sardinia, and so was the Pope. and it was in Sardinia in the mines that they were reconciled. And after they were martyred, both their bodies were brought back to Rome for burial. And so he who is the first anti-pope becomes a saint, because he essentially was following Christ, and more important, he was reconciled with the church. So then we have the epistle given to us, and this is for the persecution of Christians about which St. Paul writes. And again, for encouragement, and this applies particularly to St. Hippolytus. He says, call to mind the days gone by. In other words, remember what happened in the past. The tradition is very important to us. We need to remember it, what was given, what is handed down to us. But specifically, the apostle is saying, call to mind the days gone by, in which, after you had been enlightened, after you received baptism, you endured great conflict of sufferings. So baptism means we're opening ourselves to sufferings, because in baptism we're following Christ, and Christ suffered for the redemption of the human race. And if we are his servants, then we likewise must be willing to endure the great conflict of sufferings. But why did they suffer, and how did they suffer? He says, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by making common cause of those who feared thus. So he shows there are two ways in which we suffer. First of all, in our own person. How so? Because we're being made a public spectacle, by being reproached and being afflicted for it. Now, being reproached is bad enough, but if one is honest and wise, if one is a just and righteous person, then indeed reproaches and ridicule can be very painful. But if one is a fool or a vagabond or a deceiver, it just washes off your back. It is the person who is honest who suffers through reproaches. The dishonest, not so, because they know they deserve it, and that's what they are. And partly, so we suffer in our own person, but also we suffer in the persons of those whom we love and those whom we respect. So partly by making common cause with those who fared the same way. So once you identified with fellow Christians, and don't forget the heart of Christianity was this fraternal love, brotherly love, so that if one member suffers, all suffer. So these are two ways in which you suffer. For, he says, how did it happen in the case of others? For you both have had compassion on those in prison, and have joyfully accepted the plundering of your own goods. So he says you had compassion for those others who were suffering, but it also reflected on you, because your possessions were plundered. Because the Christians who visited those in prison were immediately identified as Christians, and they themselves were defrauded and plundered, because there was no redress in the law. But he says you didn't mind this, you joyfully accepted it. Why? Because you knew you have a better possession and a lasting one. In other words, your temporal goods were of less value to you than your spiritual goods. Because all temporal goods are essentially beneath us. They're things we possess. But the spiritual goods, not so. The spiritual goods are a gift from God, and they are like God. They come down to us. And for that reason, they are above us. And this is why we strive for virtue, and in possessing virtue, are at peace in our hearts. And so he says, you knew that you have these greater goods. Our Lord tells us the same thing. Do not store up treasure for yourself on earth, but rather in heaven, where the moth doesn't destroy it, rust doesn't corrode it, and thieves cannot steal it. So he says, you knew this, you had this better possession. So he said, do not therefore lose confidence, which has a great reward. He started by saying, call to mind the things you went through before, because God is faithful. If he has led us this far, he will continue to lead us on in the future. So he says, Therefore, your confidence should not be weakened, because the great reward has been promised. Indeed, as we know, in this current time in which we live, a time, in fact, of great tribulation, and we can see increasingly that the faithful, the Christians, are being targeted. We need to remember these things, that the saints went through it before us. We call to mind their sufferings, and we trust God that He will provide us with the grace for today. In fact, He has already done so, inasmuch as He sent His own mother at Fatima to strengthen us for the coming tribulation. She warned us that the increase in sin is in fact stirring up the anger of God. That is, we're deprived of grace. And if we're deprived of grace, then we become blinded to the realities of this condition of ourselves and of the world. And so the solution that Our Lady gives us is that we should resort to the Rosary, because it is through the Rosary that we are given the grace for the present time. And almost as if to encourage us, we know that in Japan, when the priests were thrown out of the country, the Christians who remained, the Catholics who remained, all they had was baptism and the Rosary. And they persevered in these two for 300 years, so that when the missionaries returned, they found a church there with baptism and with the Rosary. And these priests were welcome because the Christians recognized them as well. Let us then, as St. Paul says, call to mind the days gone by, what God has done for His church and for His saints, knowing that we belong to that same church and that we are the saints of today. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Santa Maria, Mater Dei,